I don't fear hackers, but I do fear auditors. Well, if that's what you hear one day, you know it is time to record a TED Talk about this subject. Compliance, actual security, is that the same? Does one lead to the other? Let's find out. Thank you for joining. My name is Lieuwe Jan Koning, and here from the Security Operations Center floor at ON2IT, we bring you TED Talks. And the subject of today, the operational gap between compliance and security. Let's get on to it.
Welcome to TED Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity.
Let me start by introducing my two guests of today. And first, on my right-hand side, it's Pieter de Lange. He is the CISO of Transdev, the Netherlands. And I know Pieter for a long time already. He's 20 years of experience in the field. And yes, about compliance, but his actual goal always is, and that always strikes me, to become actually secure. So he knows a lot about this. He speaks a lot of languages. He's been in international environments, 4 languages fluently. I mean, if you need to know something about ISO, about SOC 2, about DORA, about NIST 2, this is the guy to talk to. So I'm really happy to have him here. Pieter, welcome. Transdev, the Netherlands. Can you explain a little bit what that is?
In short, we're doing public transportation, so buses, trams, etc. We have another piece that goes about medical transportation, mostly ambulances. And we have a piece which is called transport on demand. So where we're, for example, school buses or transport of people with certain needs. So that's what we do.
Certainly something I'd love to have really secure. So thank you for joining Transdev. On my other side is Tim Timmermans, and Tim is our ON2IT CISO. And if you're the CISO of ON2IT, you're two things. One, you are the CISO of a cybersecurity company that in itself is an interesting target, of course. But secondly, you're talking to customers, our customers, not just about ON2IT security, but also about theirs and how we secure their data. So that's an extra challenge for Tim. Tim, welcome. If the goal of making things secure, how many security frameworks do you need to achieve that?
Well, I would love to have one golden framework that covers it all. But I know that that probably will keep be a dream. And in practice, it's a bit more challenging than covering it all with frameworks and standards.
For sure, we're going to talk more about that. So in this episode, what can you expect? Well, compliance and security, which comes first? Is one more important than the other? What's the relationship? That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about both the positive and the negative influences on security of security compliance frameworks. And we're going to talk about who does what. So that we have the auditor, we have the practitioner, the operator of the firewall, you have the CISO, of course. How can they all play together to make actual security a reality? I'm going to talk a little bit about the future vision of these two gentlemen on where the compliance and security evolves to. And of course, we're going to talk briefly about 3 threats that we're going to deep dive into in the coming weeks. And the threats are about the Xilium file transfer breach, the Okta data breach, and the Capital One data breach. And they share one thing. They were all happening within organizations that we are very, very compliant. So what happened? Of course, there's going to be a threat hunt where you can win t-shirts, and we'll get to that when we get there. So gentlemen, thank you very much once again for joining. The first subject is, indeed, compliance and security. Which comes first? Is it or can it be both? I mean, you can be compliant, you can be not compliant, and then maybe there's a cost to that. You can be secure and not secure, and then you get breached. What's your take on this, Pieter?
We need both, really. So not being compliant is a risk in itself because you can get fines and etc. or lose business, for example. On the other hand, not being secure, that's our main, that's why we get up in the morning, right? So we want to keep the company secure. And if you are smart, you marriage those two and you make them stronger from both sides. So
is it easy to do?
It requires one integrated strategy on how to get there, right? And the frameworks like ISO can help you in writing down the path where you need to go and helping you in making choices, but only if you really internalize that, right? So you need to, as a CISO, you really need to think like, well, how can I use this framework in my advantage to become more secure? This is, I think, the crux. And this is what they all want in the end, because they say like risk management is like one of the foundational pieces of almost any framework, is to think about what are your risks. Wow.
So it should all start with the risk. And then, so is compliance then your main tool if you want to become really secure?
I would say it is an important tool, but I think becoming secure requires a different mindset. So if you want to become secure, you need to really think like, well, what can we do to prevent data leakage? Or what can we do to prevent a ransomware attack? And that requires very technical, specific measures, right? So this is how you think if you want to become secure. However, the framework helps you to think like, well, nice that you think about all those things, but you need to make sure you have a complete inventory of all your assets. That is maybe a more boring piece, but it is crucial if you want to protect things, right? If you don't know what to protect, you can't protect it. So it strengthens each other.
Yeah. So what's the cost of not being compliant? I mean, because there's a driver or a really big incentive to pass your audit, right? And that's your weapon, I think, as any CISO. Huh?
Yeah,
I have to deal with this guy sometimes, so I know part of that firsthand. What I always find a bit troubling if I put myself in the shoes of a CISO, if you're not compliant, then there's immediate ramifications. You're not being legal anymore. You may lose customers, that kind of thing. But if you're not actually secure, it all depends on the hacker whether you get punished. Right? How do you see this? Is this how do you straighten that?
Well, I think what you need to do is visualize like the threats that we run, right? The risks that we run. This is the risk framework again. But maybe one step further, right? You need to make it very visible also to your executives. Like, hey, yes, we passed this audit. However, there are still hackers out there who will try to maybe put a ransomware attack, or who try to, if it's a state actor, they may want to, try to impact our business and stop some of our business because they can disrupt our country with that. So it really requires like this different mindset and a different set of communication to your board as well.
And this also ties into the prevention paradox, and that we as security professionals have to deal with. That if we take very good measures and we adopt all kind of controls and we have everything in place, of course, that will prevent some attacks and some hacks. But in the way that we do that very good, what is what we want and what we are aiming for. In the end, you may have some question. And I also had these conversations sometimes with board members from organizations that they say, well, do we actually need to spend money or that much money on security? Because I cannot even remember the last time we have been hacked.
Yeah, well, if there's one downside, we do zero trust a lot. If there's one downside of applying zero trust everywhere, to me, is it's harder to explain to a customer why we do all this, because it's so effective, right? That's what you mean. It's a little bit like backups, huh? If nobody complains that the backup system is down until you need it.
But there's also no framework who explicitly says like you need to do zero trust or you need to put in like an endpoint protection piece. They are much more in generic terms, right? So
is that a good thing?
And that is a good thing because you, as a CISO, you know your environment best, and you know which measures are most effective to your environment. And maybe sometimes that's being totally zero trust. Maybe sometimes you want to put some other measures out there, like an endpoint protection that might be enough for certain things, and don't go all the way on the zero trust. So you really need to figure out where to spend the money, because becoming secure is really expensive, right? So you need to balance it out. Yeah. And this is where you need to have the freedom to make those decisions. But that's why it also requires a different mindset.
I think that's also exactly the gap that we often see, and that you have these compliance requirements that focus maybe on the how or not necessarily on the how. You have the compliance requirements that focus on the why and the what. Why? Because of certain risks that are there, or certain threats. And they specify, well, you need to do something in this domain, you need to do something in this domain, but actually how you need to do that and how you need to implement that within your organization. as you say, that's often not specified. So that leaves also room for interpretation, which I agree is good, but that also gives the pitfall of not implementing the right measures in the end, because there then still may be a gap to the things that you actually do, like in the very technical level, where you say, well, you think that it is effective and it's mitigating a certain risk, but is it actually doing that? So the relationship between the things that you do and the things that you are required to do is a very important one.
Yeah. And there are controls to do the complete integrated test, if you will, like a pen test and that stuff. Is that
red teaming? Yeah.
Are there any compliance frameworks that are really good at this? Stand out in validating that actual security is there?
Well, I think if you look at the legislation of today, they all require that you do pen testing, red teaming. I think in DORA it says every 3 years you need to do a red teaming test. And I think that's a good thing, right? So
3 years.
A red team. Yeah, but what happens in reality, in real life, is you do a red teaming and you learn a tremendous lot about it, right? So you know that you have to fix things, and fixing those things take also effort, right? So typically, if you find something very
it's not that nothing happens between those red teams.
No, definitely
the red team
not.
Exercise will probably give you so much work.
It often
3
gives
years
you
is little. Now it's time to implement it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have your regular pen testing and all those kinds of things. But you as a CISO need to think what makes sense. If your assets are so important, if your crown jewels are so important that you need to do it every year, then do it every year, right? And this is where a framework or a legislation is a tool, but it is not like the golden rule necessarily always. You need to think for yourself, like, what is necessary for my organization?
Let's take an example. Tim, we talked about before we started recording this, about the Excellion file transfer service, of appliance actually, that suffered from a problem. And they have a lot of compliance frameworks and they are compliant. What happened there?
Yeah, so this is a file transfer solution provided by Excellion. It was used by a lot of large organizations like Shell and Bank of New Zealand. And it is a tool that met a lot of compliance requirements, so a lot of certifications. Therefore, it was used by these big companies because they think, well, great, we have a compliant tool, let's use that one. Only with this tool, it was reaching end of life, so it was quite old. It was to be replaced by a new version. But the risk of this, despite being compliant and meeting all of the checkboxes, is that because it was so old, there were vulnerabilities slipping in, and there were
poorly maintained.
It was poorly maintained. Yeah. So as a result, there were several attacks for this tool, and several of these larger companies were affected by it.
Yeah, it wasn't even just one thing that was wrong. It was really awful. Well, we'll see in the deep dive what went wrong. So but still compliant. I mean, what went wrong there then?
Yeah, so that's kind of the gap also between what you have on paper. So if you meet all of the checkboxes and everything on paper, or in your, maybe if you have a dashboard, everything is on green, versus what you do in practice. And also, these controls and maybe the process that you have in place, for example, to update or to patch. Well, if you say the requirement is to have a process that does that, okay, check the box. But if the process itself says, well, you need to do that maybe on an ad hoc basis or maybe once a month, that means that there will be a full month maybe with some vulnerabilities or weaknesses in your systems before it gets actually updated. So that's also the thing with it. The devil is in the details with also implementing the security and at the same time meeting those a bit more high-level compliance requirements.
Yeah, so the goal of the compliance rule or the item on the checklist needs to be translated by the actual guy who needs to secure it into an actual measure, right? And that's really hard to put in a control, I think.
Well, you need to be also very concise, right? So in this particular case, did they classify their assets well, right? And so was this a crown jewel? Did they store like very crucial data in there? If so, should they have pen tested this themselves, right? So that's what I'm wondering then, because that is part of like your frameworks in the end. And if they did that, why did the pen tester not find that? So this whole root cause analysis, why did we get to this event, is really important. And this is where, like, I think frameworks can help. Like ISO requires you to do a root cause analysis, but that can really help you in, becoming better as a company, or better as in your work, as a CISO in your work, because you want to know what went wrong in the end. So this is where I think, you should use those tools to figure out where to go next.
Yeah, but you are a bit dependent on how your suppliers implement it like that. Some things you can check. I remember that when we did our first ISO 27001 audit years ago, we actually asked all our data centers to come up with their certification. We got it, but the scope of it, they excluded physical security, for example, and it was just one data center and not all the rooms we were in. That stuff, and that we can check.
Yeah,
but how they actually do it, that's it's hopefully the auditors. Not just the auditors. They can validate everything to their best knowledge, but then still you'll need the organization to also implement it with a right.
Yeah, and I see the dependency on third parties in that is growing more and more, because every organization these days uses SaaS applications, or uses cloud services, etc. And they are often also provided by a very small group of very large companies. So that puts a lot of trust and also reliability on those few third parties. And also in conversations that I have also with multiple organizations, also with CISOs, is that you see that some CISOs realize that and they are very keen on their due diligence. But I also spoke to security professionals that think, well, it's quite easy that now a third party is doing that and they're doing the maintenance, they're doing the updates, etc. So I don't have to worry about it. Yeah. So they think, well, it's out of scope.
Look and play delusion.
In a way it is.
Yeah, until something goes wrong, obviously, because then people will look at them anyway, or at their companies, right? And then you may get the fine anyway because you did not do all your due diligence here. And this is where legislation is changing and helping us to, get a more holistic picture of what's going on.
Well, it's clear to me. We need both compliance as a tool, but also to show to the outside world how things are going, but also they should go hand in hand and forever. Yeah. Hey, let's talk a little bit about the implications of compliance on security, both good and bad. I remember that when we started in the United States, putting our data centers in Google, we use Kubernetes and Istio, so two technologies, and that we actually got a managed service of Google, this gentleman here requires us to write down. That's how I speak of it. But make it very, very explicit what our cryptographics policy is, right? And we did an analysis and put it on 4,000 something bits as a minimum key size for our certificates, and we do this everywhere. We already did. We just wrote it down, and also in this environment, and then. There was a new compliance thing within Google. They made it FIPS compliant overnight for us. I mean, we didn't know when exactly, but we did get a notice. Yeah, we're now going to be FIPS compliant. We're like, okay, yay, that's great. And then they did, and everything went down. Literally, the whole application was unreachable again. And that was because FIPS dictates that there's only 3,072 bits as a maximum on your key length. And therefore, they weren't trusted anymore, and therefore everything went down. So that is an example of how a compliance framework will actually break stuff down. What we had before was much better. We phased it out, now do it ourselves. Are there more examples of this? I mean, it can also go in the wrong direction, huh?
Yeah, and I think that there are multiple frameworks. So you have frameworks that are coming from the industry, or coming from standards like the ISO standards, ISO 27000, or the NIST standard. And you also have in the compliance domain also something that comes from the regulatory side. And for example, the EU regulations like DORA, like NIS2, like a lot of regulations that you need to comply with. So some of the compliance requirements are voluntary, some are mandatory. And you see that there's quite a difference in the extent that they specify this in detail. So the example that you mentioned, it's very explicitly mentioned. We also have other frameworks like the ISO standard that are very much more high level and that refrain from the implementation details or from very technical details. So you see that there are a lot of differences there. But indeed, it can be the case that you follow certain compliance requirements, and therefore you may need to kind of tweak your security or tweak your configuration to a level that you actually think, well, we need to do this for compliance. But how does it actually make us secure?
And to me, this shouldn't exist. How do you've done this a zillion times? How do you cope with this kind of thing?
Well, you know what I think when I'm listening to this conversation, I was thinking of something totally different. So I always think less is more, in the sense of not with cryptographic keys, obviously, but
not key length,
not key length, but generally speaking, right? And if you look at all those frameworks, they're quite extensive. They cover everything, really. And so looking at, for example, ISO, you have, I think the new version has just under 100 controls. The older one has over 100 controls. And not all of them are equally as important. So I think what you really need to do is also figure out which one are your key controls, are your primary, most important controls, and which are maybe more secondary controls. And the danger with these frameworks is that you focus on everything and try to do everything perfect, where some of those controls are really likely supportive of some risks, but are not helping you moving the bar significantly. So I think in this, a risk is that you focus on the wrong things or try to focus on everything.
What you say. So what you're saying is one control is not equal to the other one. I suspect, maybe you can speak to it, that is not in the minds of people. You're being audited. We have 20 controls. We all need to pass them. It's a Boolean value, right? We pass it or not. But you're saying...
Well, I'm still saying you should pass them, because otherwise you have a difficult conversation. And if you don't pass them, then you should put in corrective actions, and then you still pass the conversation with the auditors. But they should be appropriate to your environment. And if they're secondary and really not helping you, then you should wonder yourself, should I be doing this? And
whose job is this to get this done in an organization? Who should be leading this? Because this is a way of thinking, a translation that you need to make somehow.
I think for cyber, that would be definitely the CISO. I think in practice, you know, often a CISO has a good risk background, and they can do that probably a little bit more extensive. Often you also have a risk department who could play a role in that, but they don't always have the IT knowledge. So I think the answer is that it often lays or comes down to the CISO to help with that.
Yeah, I've experienced that if people don't understand the why, it's very difficult to actually implement the controls correctly. Because they're just getting this list, they're getting a list of requirements, just do that, implement that, and you need to report back. But that will not give a support base. So focusing on the why is fundamental, because then you make people understand why they are doing such things and why it is important. Maybe it is for actual security. Maybe it is also because of a compliance requirement that certain types of customers ask from you. But if people understand that, they are more willing to implement that. And then you can also rely on their creativity, because you have to say, okay, this is what the framework or the control or the requirements asking. How are we going to do that? And then, you also
hold that thought, because I'd love to talk about it. We're going to talk about it because what I'm interested in, how does that work in an audit conversation or in a conversation between the CISO and the practitioner, right? Before we do that, it's time for our next thread. It's the Capital one, Tim, because there clearly this was not done. I think. Can you tell us a little bit what happened there?
Yeah, so with
PCI DSS for Capital One, so it's financial.
Yeah. So PCI DSS, so that is related to the payment card industry on processing payment card data and financial information. So what happened was that there were certain misconfigurations in that environment that was hosted in AWS. And the misconfigurations, despite being audited and being fully compliant, misconfigurations were abused, resulting in over 100 million credit records being exposed, being leaked.
Consumers.
Of consumers, yeah. So end user, and that included a lot of information. So also social security numbers to some extent, but also financial information, personal data. So that was a quite significant impact for a lot of people.
Quite a detail, huh? Like configuration error the PCI DSS quite descriptive, but cannot dictate all configuration everywhere, right? And that's to what you said, the translation with the practitioner. Yeah.
Yeah, and here there's something else, but we'll do it. We'll discuss it more in detail in the deep dive. There was also a former employee that was aware of this misconfiguration and that was actually able to abuse that even after that person left the organization.
He left AWS. Huh? It was an AWS employee.
It was an AWS employee, but this after left, still aware of that misconfiguration and a way to steal
it's
that data.
Interesting to see in the deep dive indeed. A former employee of Amazon impacting you as a customer of Amazon because he has some knowledge. That's terrible. Yeah. All right. So on what you said before. So we have auditors. We have practitioners, by that I mean the people who are actually implementing the controls, making sure the right configuration is in there, the asset lists are complete, all that. And of course the CISO to stitch it all together. You both gave some hints on what should happen there. And let me give an example of what I've seen. I'll translate it into real world things. So we have a coffee machine here, and I can tell you it's a high value asset. In this floor, there needs to be coffee all the time. So suppose there is, let's say, the international committee of coffee machine security standards or whatever, and they issue a standard. And one of the things is you should not harm your employees, and that's the goal of the thing. We had some talks about how things go when you're audited against such a standard, and the goal is don't make it hot, too hot, or no, don't harm people. And then I might write down as the chief coffee officer something like coffee should be at the appropriate temperature at all times, for example. And then how does an auditor read this?
Yeah, so auditors are first of all looking at the coffee machines that you have. So what coffee machines are there? What is in scope? So how many are there? Where are they? Because then they can narrow it down to a certain selection. But then they also will ask, the appropriate temperature.
Between 60 and 80.
Okay, so that's already more specific. So
I'll change my control because I got a question by the auditor. I can fix that. I'll make it more specific.
Yeah.
Right. I abide by the auditor's rules.
Yeah. So then you need a way to measure that. So a thermometer to measure the temperature so that it's not too hot and not too cold. That gives you the insight. But that does nothing on whether it actually gets too hot or it gets too cold.
I tell you what will happen. Then I'm going to put a lot of effort in making sure that the coffee is never below 60 degrees. And therefore I need backup power and I need a continuous measurement system. I'm going to invent all kinds of controls. I'm going to log everything. And I'm going to have someone look at the logs whether the temperature doesn't get below 40. But the point is, the only thing I need is this mechanism that if the temperature is too high, beyond 80 degrees or 90, that it shuts down, right? That's all I want.
So in Greece, I was introduced to the concept of iced coffee. So I think that could serve here in the floor as well, right? So on hot days.
So that's what you would bring to the table when you're talking to an auditor.
So if we're talking to the auditor, like what is the risk? And, why don't we take a different route with this?
Is this a conversation that happens enough?
I don't.
I'm sure you. I know you do.
I used to be an auditor, so I know the conversation I would like to have with the auditors. And the conversation in our case is often about what is the risk, what is the true risk, and sometimes things are simply compliance, right? So if it's yes no, then it is yes no. So then there is not a lot of conversation, but often there is like the risk aspect to it. And this is what everyone should bring to the table. Ask your auditor, what is the risk of what you're actually saying now? Because we know our environment. We know the risks of our environment way better than the auditor. The auditor walks in for 2 weeks or 1 week or a few days even sometimes. And if we don't help the auditor to understand our environment, they cannot make the right judgment. So they're happy with your thoughts, I'm sure. So this is what I do. And sometimes, you get into intensive discussions about certain things that can really happen. But normally that leads to something.
So if I understand you correctly, whenever there is an audit situation and a discussion on are we compliant or did we bring enough evidence, always get back to the original risk and to the original goal of the mitigative control that should prevent that risk. And always make sure that never lose that side.
Never lose that. Yeah.
Is this practice, Tim?
Yeah, so this is exactly the why, where you need to focus on in the first place. And I see that it depends a bit per organization, but I see that once people realize that, also the people on the technical department or maybe HR, we need to keep in mind that for a lot of standards, also not only the technical department is involved. And with a lot of certification. It is also, it's quite a broad scope and can impact many people in the organization in the end. So we need to keep that in mind. And then if we see that, that people understand that, then you switch your attention from, okay, we need to have all measures in place for the coffee machine. But maybe if we know that people already like iced coffee way more than hot coffee, then we solve the problem because, in the end, the ultimate end goal, we don't want to harm people because of the coffee. That is something that you will still achieve, but in a different way. So I rely a lot on the creativity of people who are on a day-to-day basis working in the field or in the operations to make the judgment as long as they understand the why and also what needs to happen because of the requirements, to translate that on how can I do that in the best way?
Yeah, and then to your point, less is more.
Definitely. And I think to build on what Tim is saying here, I think it's crucial that in your policies, you add who is responsible for what, add a hierarchy. Because that really helps people to see what is their role in security. And because to your point, the board has a role, HR has a role, procurement has a role, IT obviously has a role. The receptionist has a role. We almost everyone in a company has a role to play in security. And if people understand what their role is and why, then we become really secure. Because if it just comes down to me and my team, to the CISO and some security folks, we're not going to be safe.
Yeah,
so we really need to do it together. Yeah.
Avoid saying these are the 10 things you need to do, but say, this is our ultimate goal, what we want to achieve, and we thought that these are the things that need to do. Take them as a guidance, and if you don't agree with them, speak up, something like that.
But this is also this is your role. Your role includes making sure we timely do a pen test. Your role includes asking the visitor sorry, sir, can I see your ID? I think, we need to make sure that everyone understands their role. I think that's the crucial piece that often doesn't go well.
And this can be. I mean, for our company, we're a cybersecurity company, so security is kind of ingrained in it's part of our DNA. So it's and people know what type of company they're working. But fostering a culture where people actually have this mindset can be quite challenging for other types of organization. And I believe it starts with that, because otherwise you can say all rules. Thou shall not do this and do that and whatever, but people will find a way to circumvent that. That's also what you see with the use of certain applications, for example, that they still find a way to use an application, even though we say, no, that's not allowed for you. Is it better to make them aware of the risks themselves? So in a way, everyone is wearing the risk hat to identify those risks and to do the right thing to keep those risks under control.
Gotcha. We have so far been talking about controls. Let's dive a little bit more into this, because in the beginning I asked you how many frameworks do you want? You want one.
A very good one.
One very good one. Yeah. So but in reality you have several. Yeah.
Right.
Pieter, you walked in here this morning and said you were ecstatic.
Euphoric.
Yeah, exactly. Because yesterday you passed a series of audits, right?
Yeah.
And you got a certification again. In a certain way, it was a breeze, because and that's all to do how you set it all up. And it can be challenging to have ISO, to have PCI DSS, to have SOC 2, to have DORA, all of them, and they all together need to be there. And that can be And then it becomes to the practitioners like, yeah, now I have SOC 2, now I have ISO. You solve this in a different way.
Yeah. So I think it starts with having a good tool that can help you. So we have a great tool. We put in all our policies, but also our risks, our controls, our control testing. And we have workflows behind all of those things. So once you set that up and you start testing those things and you go to an audit, like the last few days, like people from different parts of the organization went to our risk tool and they clicked to show the evidence with proud to the auditors, right? And the auditors look, we get back to the risk tool again. So that's really working, right? So I think that is the foundation now. So now my next challenge is like one framework would be great, but we have different stakeholders. So from a credit card perspective, you need to be PCI DSS compliant. We need to be ISO compliant so we can, get some work from the different
your clients
institutes from our clients. Yeah. So, but then you have like a shareholder who happens to be a bank, who comes with a different framework again. So if we do all those things in isolation, then we're busy like 5 times in a row, right? Because 5 or 6 frameworks that you need to comply with. So what we're working on now is merging all of those things into one risk control set and linking like the different controls. So if someone asks me like, now I would like to see the PCI controls, we run the report with all the items where PCI DSS is tick marked. But we test the control just once because that's enough, or once per period that you set up, right? So that is the way of thinking. Test once, reuse for the different frameworks, and you can do that if you link them. So that's what we're working on right now.
So practitioners no longer trying to be compliant with both ISO and all of the frameworks individually, but compliant to your own control. That happens to translate into if the audit of the day is SOC 2, then it's these 4.
Yeah.
So and if it's DORA, then it's these other 6. Or something.
And it can be your control, as you say. It can also be like that you select a control set and then link the other ones to it. And often a lot of that work has been done already. You can find it in the field. But that's really helpful. And if you nail that down, then it's not that much work anymore. But still, keeping in mind what is truly important for you as a company. Yeah. So you need to keep on conveying that message.
Available in the field, Tim.
Yeah. I think this approach is not only desirable, but it is also becoming more and more a necessity. And so what we also see, we have various customers from various sectors. So all of the compliance requirements that they also have to deal with, it's I don't know even how many anymore. It's a huge list. So yeah, every requirement list has its own scope and its own viewpoint, of course. But what we see that because of the large amount of overlap, it's useful to start this mapping. And what we did is also to start this mapping from a perspective of zero trust measures. So we take the zero trust measures, which is a set of about 30-40 measures on a more technical level, but they are vendor and technology agnostic. And we say, to successfully implement zero trust, these are measures that may be relevant. And all of these measures we mapped to a lot of frameworks, and we're still doing that on a weekly basis when new frameworks come out for the automotive industry or for the financial sector, etc. So that also helps to when organizations are working on building a secure organization and they focus on their crown jewels first, because it's the highest risk. They know, okay, we need these zero trust measures. And because we have these measures, we can comply with ISO requirement X, and we comply with CIS controls requirement Y, etc. So you don't take the compliance requirements and frameworks as a starting point, but it's rather an end result of already doing the right thing and focusing on the security aspect at first from a zero trust perspective.
Yeah, so you have say your trade portal as a financial institution, and you know what measures have been taken there, and therefore you can map it. Oh, that means that you're compliant with these chapters in ISO, these chapters in PCI DSS, and do it like that, and then you can map it to anything that exists.
And also in the future, when there are new regulations or there are new frameworks, you can add that to the existing mapping, of course, right? So you need to, and then of course there can still be some gaps, like maybe you need to do 10 or 20% extra. Well, but that's already way better than doing everything at once again.
Yeah. So in practice, for example, if you look at ISO, the latest version of ISO, the 2022 version, that maps really well on NIS2 requirements. And if you look then at like what is required from NEN 7510, I believe, the health security standard, that also maps very well on that. So if you do that all in isolation, you're not efficient, and you really need a whole army of people to get that done. So we need to be smart, otherwise we cannot keep up in modern worlds really, and be compliant and be meeting all those the requirements of all our stakeholders, because that's really what this is, right? We do this for stakeholders.
My conclusion is we already got this one golden thing. It's called a common control framework then.
Yeah,
if you do it properly.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. I promised 3 threats, so let's go to the third one. It's the Okta threat. And Okta is a cybersecurity company, so they're really, really secure, of course. And they are very proud of all the certifications. You can look at the list online, and there's a long list. However, they got breached in October 2023. Tim, what happened?
Yeah, so there was this employee of Okta, and that person was using a personal Google account, was logged in with that via Chrome, via the browser. You can sync your tabs and your bookmarks, etc. And somehow the login credentials for that user, for the Okta portal environment, were saved in that person's personal Google account. Well, and then via another way, it's still a bit unclear, but probably via phishing or etc., that personal Google account was compromised, and that resulted in an attacker being able to access that Okta environment and also to steal certain tokens or session tokens, and therefore being able to access the customer environment for a lot of the Okta customers. And here the funny thing is that it was not initially detected and discovered by Okta itself, but rather by one of their customers, by 1Password. They are using Okta as well, but they detected some strange other security company, on the password management side, and they were detecting some suspicious behavior, and that was how the investigation started.
Yeah, we'll dive deep into it. It's an interesting one. I mean, 2 security companies, one keeping the other honest, and how can you possibly prevent this? Because which control in your control frameworks is actually the one that prevents this? Huh? It's again in the details where things go wrong.
Yeah.
Before we take a peek into the future, it's time for the treasure hunt. You can win a cool T-shirt, and we can ship it to you. Just send us this to code@threat-talks.com, and the code is 092403, and it's also in the screen right now. If you want that, be quick. The first 200 get one. So, future, gentlemen. We've talked about how compliance, security, our goal is to have them go hand in hand. They're not necessarily hand in hand, so we need to do some work for this. We also talked about the role of the CISO, the practitioner, the auditor, and that there needs to be this conversation. Keep it lean, keep it practical, always keep the risks in mind, keep the goal of a control in mind, and not focus on the details at that level. What's to come? How does this evolve?
Well, I think one of the things that you see in the legislations is that the boardroom is being held personally liable to ensuring that laws are, like security laws like NIS2, are being enforced. So I think that's a big change that's coming our way. This is really going to help us all to be, compliant at least.
Yeah, so that means, to be clear, that means that if your supplier gets hacked and your data is there, you can actually go to the CEO personally and sue them and say, listen, this is my damage. I'm going to take away your car and your home. Is that's what they're saying?
It's not like that.
Oh.
So if the company didn't take all the measures that one would expect, then you may end up there, right? If they were neglective as a company, if they did not support, bringing on sufficient security. If the CISO goes to the board and they say, hey, here we have a high risk, and the board says like, well, we accept that risk, then that is up to the board in the end. But then if something goes wrong, it's also up to the board. If we don't get the money, if Tim and I don't get the money to fix things, to help fix things, then, we can't help making the company secure. So this is where,
I can imagine this changes the game in favor of security.
for sure.
That's why you're happy about it. And why we should all be happy about that.
Yeah, but I think it is also good that, we need, as a CISO, we need to take the board along. So we have a responsibility here as well, because too often CISOs talk encrypted and they don't take the board along with, what needs to happen. So we need to, as a CISO, also learn to speak the board language here. And I think that's the other thing that's crucial in this piece. Another thing, stepping into the future, what you see is like risk management is a big component of all new legislation and also of ISO, right? So know your risks, put in the sufficient controls, and get better every day. I think that is what is expected. No one expects to be perfect from day one. And we can't, right? Because the world around us evolves very quickly, so we need to keep on evolving as well. But we need to keep on evolving. If we stand still, we will be hacked eventually. That's how it works. So we all have that responsibility, and we need
saw
to.
An example of a non-maintained file sharing application. Huh?
Yeah. And I think another big thing that we all have responsibility for is that we don't just look at our own company, but look at our vendors, right? So we had 3 examples, I believe now, where the vendor dropped the ball, and we need to at least do our diligence and be in contact. So if you're using a certain application that is a crown jewel for you, then you'd better be in very close contact with them, that if something goes wrong, in no time. And you have like good communication lines. And if you don't have that will become problematic. And we will learn that quicker and quicker. In the past, we had all our applications running in our own data centers. Right now, everything is running in the cloud. You have SaaS solutions. So knowing what your crown jewels are and taking appropriate measures, and that can be different per crown jewel, is crucial. And that's
is the market already mature in that area, you think? This security of the supply chain?
I think we're rapidly catching up. I see that at least in, banks financial institutions need to comply with DORA. They focus very much on that. So banks are doing working really hard on catching up. NIS2 runs a little bit behind DORA in my feeling. I think the Dutch implementation will be done only next year. But still, you need to comply with similar things. You need to know your assets. So yes, we're catching up, but we're not there yet. And I think the other thing is you need to be in contact also with your other partners. You're not in this alone, right? So you need to, like if you're working in transport, then you need to also talk to people in transport to see, well, what threats do you see? What do you see happening in the real world? That's also helping. So I think we have a responsibility to not only look inside, but also look outside.
Yeah, and I think a way to approach this is kind of an overall approach, at least what we are trying to do ourselves as well as for our customers, is that we kind of combine that in a zero trust strategy. So we focus on, well, what are your business objectives? So that's also the alignment and the involvement with C-level, with the board, because they typically are also focusing on that, maybe not from a security perspective as a starting point, but once it's clear what the actual risks are and how that can threaten your business objectives, then that will also stimulate their involvement. So focusing on what business outcomes are for your organization, and then by that also seeing, okay, what are the risks and to what parts in the organization technical and non-technical, do these risks apply? And so know what adds value within your organization and know what you want to protect, rather than where you can be attacked on and everything that you may be potentially vulnerable. I see that a lot of organizations do not even know fully what do I have and what do I want to protect. And I think that's a critical first step to know also, like you mentioned, the crown jewels. They are high risk, so focus on them. But also how these crown jewels are related to other systems, because you can have a dependency or kind of a whole chain of vulnerabilities that are still maybe impact. And once you have that you can then select the right framework and also select the right controls, being able to scope that. And the scoping part is something that if you do that properly and you know what to protect, that also again helps in understanding why we are doing things. If we don't take these measures, if we don't implement these controls to protect our data, then the risk is that between now and 24 hours, that application will be down and we cannot do our primary business. There in the transportation company, if we do not protect that adequately, then we will not be able to ship out containers the next day. And if that resonates with people and they understand why and how that contributes on a business level, I think then you can focus also on taking the right technical measures for those specific environments and also on an organization level do the right things.
Zero Trust really helps in bringing that focus. Huh? I mean, the great thing about that is that you have a few your high value applications. You take them separate and individually secure them and make sure the compliance frameworks are applied, all the controls are in there. Then you know at least that the stuff that is most important to you is gets the most attention.
Yeah, and it helps you as an organization. It helps also the auditor because they know what they're looking at. Yeah. They also know, okay, this is the scoping. Scope is clear. So you know what you're talking about. You know what you're dealing with, and you also know what may be out of scope. So also in the quality of your controls, that will contribute. No matter if it's managed by you or indeed for a third party. In the end, you will still want to have the risk to an acceptable level. And you need to take the right controls.
It's at the risk of sounding very old now. In 1969, the Dutch volleyball team got the gold medal in the Olympic Games. And I remember that the coach was asked, like, well, what is the secret of your team? And he said, and I remember that very well, doing simple things really well. And I think, unfortunately, that is also true for security. If you don't have your CMDB in order, if you don't do your backups properly, if you don't have all those basic things in order, security will fail. So it starts with doing simple things really well. And we should not forget that.
That's
and
a
that
great
is not
takeaway.
A sexy thing, but it is a very effective measure. So, yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think we learned a lot today. First of all, compliance is crucial, and so is security. And we need to do a lot of work to make them go hand in hand, right? There needs to, and we all share the same objective. That's great. There's nothing. I mean, do I fear hackers or do I fear the auditors? Well, I fear them both in that sense. But the solution is very, very clear. There's lots of things we can do about it, and we should have this conversation with the auditors and the craftsmen that configure the firewall, configure the web application firewall in a proper way. That they need to. Well, you told me the risk needs to be clear. The objective of a control needs to be clear, and then let's put them all in a central portal so we can keep track of it. And we should keep raising the bar, because hackers do not sleep, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Our viewers, we have some infographics for you available in the show notes, especially on the 3 threats we are talking about. In the upcoming weeks, we will deep dive into them. What happened exactly there? Interesting to understand. Well, thank you. Thank you, Pieter. Thank you, Tim, for today, for all the insights you gave to us all. To our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. If you liked what you saw today, please like us and subscribe to this channel. It helps us spread the word better. It's that's our mission, to make sure that everybody knows as much as possible about cybersecurity, so we are as resilient as possible. You can also give us feedback, leave something in the show notes, or email us at team@threat-talks.com. We'd love to hear from you. And from the Security Operations Center floor here at On2IT, I thank you very much once again and hope to see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by On2IT Cybersecurity and AMS-IX. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.